On a humid night in 1863, deep within the rolling hills of northern Arkansas, the Carver family prepared to celebrate what should have been a joyful union. The wedding had been planned meticulously, an event meant to unite not only two lives, but two branches of a well-established frontier family. Lanterns hung from wooden beams, their flickering glow illuminating freshly swept floors and the embroidered fabric of simple but carefully made decorations. Guests arrived in subdued clothing, the modest frontier dress betraying both social status and the practical demands of life in a rural and war-torn region. The air was thick with anticipation, the scent of wildflowers mingling with smoke from the hearths, a delicate balance of celebration and survival. Yet beneath the surface of cordial smiles and polite conversation, an undercurrent of unease whispered through the gathering, unnoticed by all but the most attentive observers. The Carvers themselves were a family known for discipline, propriety, and quiet influence in the county. Patriarch Jonathan Carver, a man of stern features and tightly controlled demeanor, was respected by neighbors for his farming skill and his strict adherence to social expectation. His new bride, Margaret, young and pale, exuded a nervous energy that was both palpable and enigmatic. Guests whispered about her delicacy, the unusual intensity of her gaze, and the meticulousness with which she followed the household's complex domestic routines. Even in the midst of celebration, there was something restrained about her movements, as if every gesture had been rehearsed in secret, or as if some unseen force dictated her conduct. The shadows of the room seemed to cling more closely around her, distorting the candlelight into shapes that danced on the walls with an almost accusatory rhythm. As the evening progressed, the wedding feast unfolded with quiet ceremony. Platters of roasted meats, freshly baked bread, and boiled vegetables were laid out on long tables. Families and neighbors exchanged polite conversation, though eyes often flicked nervously toward Margaret and Jonathan, sensing that this marriage, so ceremonious on the surface, held deeper currents of tension. A sudden draft from a half-open window made the candles flicker violently, casting unfamiliar shadows that crawled across the walls like living things. Guests paused momentarily, the stillness of that moment stretching long into the mind, and the natural sounds of the surrounding night, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an owl took on an ominous tone. The ordinary became uncanny, and the sense that the evening held secrets that would not remain hidden intensified with every passing hour. A series of minor incidents began to unfold almost imperceptibly. A spilled goblet of wine here, a dropped utensil there, each minor disruption magnified by the tense atmosphere. Margaret's sudden movements, quick and precise, drew curious glances. Jonathan's measured responses, calm yet tightly controlled, suggested the presence of forces both domestic and psychological, unseen yet unmistakable. Guests whispered about the unusual orderliness of the household, the eerie quiet that seemed to envelop certain corners of the room, and the occasional fleeting glance from the bride toward an empty wall or shadowed corner, as though expecting something or someone to appear. The ordinary merriment of a wedding night was being quietly infiltrated by an unnatural rhythm, the subtle signs of danger that few were willing to name aloud. By the time darkness fully descended, the sensation of something withheld, something quietly menacing, became almost tangible. The Carver house, normally a place of warmth and light, was suffused with a different kind of energy, deliberate, controlled, and suffocating. The combination of isolation, strict household rules, and unspoken social expectations created a pressure that pressed upon every guest. Every creak of floorboard, every shifting of chairs, every whisper carried amplified significance. Observers felt the weight of unspoken rules and hidden histories, a nervous attention to detail that transformed the domestic space into a theater of suspense. In this environment, Margaret's presence, her movements, and even her silences became central, like the pivot point around which the household's delicate balance teetered. Outside, the Arkansas night continued in quiet contrast. Distant calls of animals, the occasional wind through sparse trees, and the rhythmic chirping of insects formed a calm yet unsettling soundtrack. Inside, shadows seemed to hold their breath, and even the bravest of neighbors felt their attention pulled inward, toward the Carver household, as though the walls themselves whispered the approaching inevitability of events that would haunt the family for years to come. The first hints of the disturbing wedding night were already present: minor accidents, inexplicable chills, and the sense that unseen eyes were observing the smallest gestures. The night's proceedings, intended to mark joy and union, were quietly subverted by the eerie rhythm of secrecy, anticipation, and the unknown. In this quiet, yet tense atmosphere, the Carver family's night began its slow, inexorable descent into a series of events that would be recorded in whispers, local accounts, and the memories of those who survived. The story of this wedding night was not only about celebration, but about the fragility of human control in the face of isolation, domestic authority, and unanticipated hazards. From the faintest disturbance to the most noticeable mishap, the subtle hints of danger, fear, and secrecy combined to form the first thread of a narrative that would stretch into mystery, horror, and reflection. The Carver household, with its lanterns, shadows, and hushed conversations, became the setting for a quiet but escalating series of incidents that would define both the family and the folklore of the region. In these first hours, the audience of history might sense a tension that is nearly imperceptible yet unavoidable. A calm, measured tension that, when observed carefully, carries within it the seeds of horror, curiosity, and the reflective questions that would linger long after. The lanterns dimmed and the guests departed. The Carvers' wedding night, seemingly ordinary on the surface, held within it an extraordinary weight, the weight of secrecy, anticipation, and the unpredictable intersection of human behavior and circumstance. This was the night where ordinary life met an invisible, encroaching darkness, a night that history would remember not for its celebration, but for the subtle, creeping terror that quietly unfolded within the walls of the Carver home. The mid-19th century in Arkansas was a time of profound upheaval, not merely because of the ongoing Civil War, but also due to the unique social and cultural structures that defined life in the frontier counties. Families like the Carvers were rooted in agricultural labor, bound to the land through generations of farming practices that demanded relentless effort, resourcefulness, and resilience. The landscape itself, rolling hills, dense forests, and winding rivers, shaped the rhythms of daily existence. Isolation was common, and communities were scattered, making travel perilous and interaction with neighbors a carefully timed activity, often dependent on weather and terrain. In such an environment, the structures of family authority and domestic life were both practical and rigid. Patriarchal heads determined work, behavior, and social standing, while women navigated complex domestic responsibilities under constant scrutiny. Marriage in this context carried significance far beyond personal union. It was a social contract with economic, familial, and cultural implications. Land, property, and inheritance were often intertwined with marital arrangements, and unions were planned with attention to social networks, labor distribution, and the preservation of family influence. The Carver family, like many in the region, understood that a wedding was not merely a celebration, but a strategic reinforcement of social cohesion. Communities viewed such ceremonies as markers of stability, a way to signal that despite external pressures, war, disease, isolation, the family remained orderly and morally upright. In a place where law enforcement and formal institutions were limited, social expectation functioned as the primary mechanism of order, with families held accountable to neighbors, clergy, and local custom. Daily life demanded a rhythm of labor and survival that left little room for error. Men worked in fields, tending livestock and cultivating crops, while women managed households, prepared food, and oversaw children. The interdependence of labor, family hierarchy, and social expectation created a high-stakes environment for both men and women. Any deviation from prescribed roles could result in gossip, reputational damage, or practical difficulties, especially in smaller settlements where oversight was constant and anonymity rare. For the Carvers, these pressures were compounded by their social prominence. They were observed closely, and the slightest misstep carried consequences beyond the immediate household. The balance between control, obedience, and domestic efficiency was delicate, with tension often simmering beneath the calm surface of daily routines. The region's history also added layers of anxiety and moral complexity to social life. Arkansas, divided by loyalties during the Civil War, was a place where suspicion and caution permeated even private interactions. News traveled slowly, and rumors could gain traction in ways that altered perception and behavior dramatically. Guests attending social events like the Carver's wedding would have been acutely aware of the broader political and cultural instability, and this awareness intensified the significance of order, propriety, and caution within the home. Conversations were measured, actions were deliberate, and even seemingly mundane decisions, how to arrange the seating, which dishes to serve, or how to address a relative, were infused with the awareness of both social and political consequence. Cultural norms in 1863 Arkansas emphasized patriarchal authority, religious observance, and moral propriety. Families were guided by deeply held beliefs about duty, obedience, and the moral hierarchy within households. Husbands exercised control over both labor and social interaction, while women were expected to maintain domestic order and exemplify virtue. Social rituals, such as weddings, functioned not only as personal celebrations, but also as demonstrations of moral and social alignment, signaling to the broader community that family structures were intact and functional. These expectations were particularly acute in isolated regions, where deviations could be observed and interpreted as threats to communal stability. The Carver's wedding was therefore more than a personal milestone. It was a public affirmation of social adherence, making the household both a center of celebration and a stage for intense scrutiny. Frontier medical knowledge and domestic safety practices also shaped the environment. While midwives and local healers were common, access to trained physicians was limited. Accidents from falls on uneven floors to injuries from knives, axes, and farm implements were frequent, and their management relied heavily on improvisation, home remedies, and local wisdom. Families developed routines and precautionary measures to mitigate risk, though these were far from foolproof. In the Carver household, where preparation for a wedding heightened activity and required precise coordination, even minor accidents could escalate into dramatic or frightening events. Knowledge of such risks existed alongside superstition and moral interpretation, further complicating the social psychology of everyday life. Isolation amplified both physical and psychological tension. Roads were muddy and dangerous, rivers swelled unpredictably, and sudden illness or injury could leave individuals reliant solely on the immediate household for care. Within the Carver home, the concentration of family members and guests during the wedding created an environment where the potential for missteps, accidents, and emotional strain was exceptionally high. Every movement carried significance, every sound was scrutinized, and every decision carried the potential to exacerbate stress or create unforeseen consequences. The intensity of domestic vigilance, combined with the broader context of frontier instability, set the stage for a night in which ordinary life could swiftly turn into distress, chaos, and fear. Religious and moral guidance were intertwined with daily life, shaping both interpretation and response to unexpected events. Clergy offered counsel, framed misfortune in moral terms, and guided community perception, reinforcing the importance of social conformity and moral observation. Within the home, families internalized these lessons, creating a culture where fear, discretion, and observation were as much a part of life as cooking, cleaning, and labor. The presence of outsiders, guests, extended family, or neighbors brought additional pressure, as the household attempted to maintain appearances while managing the inherent risks of concentrated activity. Every minor incident could be imbued with moral significance, and every response carried both practical and ethical weight. The Carver household, representative of many frontier families, thus existed at the intersection of multiple pressures: the physical demands of labor and survival, the social expectations of propriety and authority, the moral guidance of religion, and the psychological tension of isolation and observation. Weddings and other social events intensified these pressures, transforming ordinary domestic spaces into environments charged with anticipation, caution, and latent danger. Within this context, the events of the wedding night, seemingly private and celebratory, were predisposed to escalate into situations of tension, fear, and profound consequence. The cultural, social, An environmental fabric of the time created a perfect storm in which ordinary actions could acquire extraordinary significance, setting the stage for the disturbing incidents that would define the Carver family's night and the local memory of it for decades to come. The night had grown heavy with the weight of anticipation when the first incident quietly disrupted the rhythm of celebration. A tray of steaming dishes, carried hastily by one of the Carver children, slipped from small hands, scattering food across the floor. The sound, startling in the otherwise hushed room, drew every gaze to the spill. Margaret's reaction was swift and precise. She knelt, retrieving the fallen plates and instructing the child in measured tones. But even this simple fall carried with it a tremor of tension. Guests exchanged wary glances. Each minor misstep seemed magnified in the dense atmosphere of expectation and isolation. The spilled food became more than a domestic accident. It was a reminder of fragility, a signal that the evening would not unfold without disruption. Minutes later, Jonathan himself experienced a near accident. While adjusting the lanterns along the main hallway, his boot caught on a loose floorboard. The creak was sharp and resonant, and for a moment, all activity ceased. Shadows seemed to twist unnaturally along the walls as the lanterns flickered, producing long, dancing figures that appeared almost human. Jonathan recovered quickly, but the sudden jolt of adrenaline coursed through the room. Observers felt their own pulse quicken, aware that even a minor misstep could lead to injury or expose the household's carefully maintained composure. In this environment, the line between ordinary movement and dramatic incident blurred, the ordinary becoming charged with menace. Later, in the dimly lit kitchen, a small fire ignited when a pan of hot coals tipped from the hearth. Smoke began to curl up toward the rafters, and the smell of singed wood filled the air. Margaret moved with practiced efficiency, extinguishing the embers before any damage occurred. Yet the incident left the room tense and alert. Each guest and family member, previously engrossed in conversation or observation, now registered the fragility of the domestic space. The flickering shadows produced by the sudden flare created illusions of figures moving in corners, whispers of danger that heightened the sense of suspense. The Carver household, normally a place of warmth and routine, had become a landscape of unpredictable risk and quiet terror. As the evening progressed, the first serious accident occurred. One of the younger children, rushing to answer a call from a relative, slipped on the polished wooden stairs. A sharp cry pierced the room, followed by the sound of impact against the cold boards below. Panic and instinctive movement filled the space. Jonathan rushed to lift the child, examining for broken bones or bruises. Margaret's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she tended to the child. Guests, frozen for a moment, realized that the household's careful order was fragile. What had begun as minor disruptions now became events of genuine concern, testing the composure of all present and amplifying the sense of danger that had quietly pervaded the room. In another part of the house, a more sinister series of incidents unfolded. A misplaced axe, set aside after preparation of firewood earlier in the day, was accidentally nudged by a visiting relative. The sound of metal striking stone echoed through the hallway. Margaret's eyes widened, recognizing the latent threat that had gone unnoticed, and she quickly secured the tool. Yet the moment lingered. The close proximity of sharp objects, combined with the uneven floorboards and dim lighting, transformed ordinary objects into instruments of potential catastrophe. Neighbors and guests became hyper-aware of every movement, each shadow, each reflective surface, as the ordinary domestic setting seemed to take on the qualities of a haunted landscape. Throughout the night, several other small but alarming incidents occurred almost simultaneously. A falling candle sent a ribbon decoration ablaze, producing smoke and a sudden flurry of movement. A dropped knife narrowly missed the foot of a maid rushing to respond to the commotion. The combination of physical risk and psychological tension created a feedback loop. Minor accidents heightened alertness, which in turn amplified the perception of danger, transforming the home into a space of almost unbearable suspense. Margaret and Jonathan moved through the house with precision, their awareness of every footstep, every object, and every shadow intensified by the knowledge that disaster could occur at any moment. Guests followed suit, their movements cautious, their voices subdued, their eyes scanning every corner for potential hazards. A particularly chilling moment occurred in the attic loft, where one of the younger girls had wandered unnoticed. A loose floorboard gave way under her weight, producing a loud crack and a startled cry. Margaret rushed to the scene, discovering the child unharmed but visibly shaken. The intensity of fear, though mitigated by the absence of injury, left a lingering unease among those who witnessed it. In the quiet that followed, every creak of the structure, every wind gust rattling the windows, and every flicker of lantern light was imbued with heightened significance. The house itself seemed to participate in the unfolding drama, its imperfections, amplifying the psychological tension and creating an almost cinematic rhythm of suspense. By midnight, a series of minor yet cumulatively terrifying events coalesced into a full sense of crisis. A guest tripped on a hidden step, knocking over a lantern. Sparks flew onto the wooden floor, producing a brief but alarming flare. Margaret and Jonathan moved swiftly to contain the fire, their actions precise yet tense, aware that a single miscalculation could result in serious injury or destruction of property. The interplay of shadows, sound, and the anticipation of further accidents created an atmosphere thick with apprehension. Each individual in the household felt the subtle pressure of invisible forces, the accumulated anxiety of a night full of small but consequential hazards, the awareness of social and familial expectations, and the inherent fragility of life in a frontier home. Even the external environment contributed to the tension. The wind howled across the Arkansas plains, rattling the structure and casting shifting shadows across windows. Distant animal cries seemed amplified, each hoot or rustle producing a momentary spike of fear. The house, isolated and surrounded by darkness, became a microcosm of risk, anticipation, and observation. Within these walls, every object, every movement, every sound was transformed by perception, creating a landscape where minor accidents took on an almost theatrical significance. The household's careful routines were strained to the limit, and even the most trivial action, reaching for a dish, adjusting a lantern, stepping over a rug, could trigger a chain reaction of tension, fear, and possible injury. Towards the end of the evening, the culmination of these incidents produced a profound and silent horror. Shadows on the walls appeared to move independently, reflecting the heightened alertness and imagination of the observers. The house itself seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding with the nervous energy of its occupants. Margaret, moving through the rooms with calculated efficiency, became the central figure in this quiet but relentless drama. Her presence, both calming and tense, guided the household through the cascade of mishaps and near misses. Yet the psychological imprint of the night, the tension, the anticipation, the awareness of fragility would remain long after the guests departed, leaving a lasting impression of terror and awe interwoven with domestic ritual. The Carver family's wedding night, intended as a celebration of union, thus became a sequence of escalating incidents. From minor spills and falls to near injuries caused by ordinary objects, each event was magnified by isolation, darkness, and heightened social expectation. The quiet horror of the night did not rely on supernatural intervention, but on the psychological and environmental pressures intrinsic to frontier life. Shadows, imperfect structures, unfamiliar surroundings, and the constant awareness of potential danger. By its conclusion, the household had endured a full spectrum of fear, tension, and relief, setting the stage for communal reflection, moral interpretation, and the enduring legend of the Carver family's disturbing wedding night. News of the Carver family's wedding night incident spread slowly at first, whispered from neighbor to neighbor along the dirt roads and through scattered homesteads. In a community accustomed to the unpredictability of frontier life, initial responses were cautious curiosity rather than outright alarm. Yet as stories accumulated of near accidents, falling objects, and tense confrontations, tension began to ripple through the county. Families speculated quietly about the causes, each conversation weaving together fragments of observation, rumor, and moral interpretation. The isolated nature of the region meant that first-hand knowledge was scarce, and the imagination quickly filled gaps, often emphasizing danger, disorder, and human fragility. The Carver household became a focal point not only for the family's own attention, but also for the moral and social reflections of the wider settlement. Neighbors described the incidents with a mixture of fascination and fear. Some expressed concern over the household's safety protocols, noting the frequent accidents and close calls as evidence of inadequate oversight or poor domestic organization. Others framed the events in moral terms, suggesting that the intensity of family control, social expectation, or even divine will might have contributed to the strange occurrences. The combination of physical risk and psychological tension was interpreted through multiple lenses: practical caution, social critique, and spiritual reflection. Every retelling reinforced the perception that the Carver household had been subjected to an extraordinary strain, elevating ordinary domestic accidents into stories of suspense and warning. Local clergy played a significant role in shaping community response. Pastors, often serving as both spiritual guides and arbiters of social norms, visited the Carver household to provide counsel and offer moral interpretation. They emphasized prudence, vigilance, and the ethical duties of both husband and wife, framing the night's incidents as instructive examples of human fallibility and the need for careful stewardship of domestic space. Sermons occasionally referenced the Carvers indirectly, highlighting the balance between obedience, foresight, and communal responsibility. The blending of spiritual guidance with practical advice reinforced the moral dimension of the incidents, embedding the story of the wedding night deeply within the community's collective consciousness. Medical perspectives, though limited by frontier conditions, also influenced interpretation. Local physicians and midwives were consulted regarding injuries and the prevention of future accidents. Their observations emphasized the physical realities of isolated households: uneven floors, inadequate lighting, and the presence of sharp implements or hot surfaces were recognized as genuine hazards. Advice given combined practical remedies with preventative strategies, yet the scarcity of formal medical oversight meant that psychological impacts, heightened alertness, tension, and fear were largely unaddressed. Families absorbed these reports alongside the more sensational accounts of guests and neighbors, reinforcing both the plausibility and the drama of the events. In the minds of observers, the incidents were both explainable and mysterious, ordinary in occurrence yet extraordinary in consequence. Newspaper accounts, when they arrived, were often delayed and filtered through the lens of editorial interpretation. Reporters described the Carver wedding as a remarkable example of frontier life's precariousness, highlighting the tension between celebration and danger, domestic care and accident. Headlines emphasized suspense, using evocative language that underscored the combination of ordinary events with extraordinary consequence. For residents and distant readers alike, these reports reinforced the narrative of suspense, drama, and moral reflection. The dissemination of such accounts extended the reach of the story beyond immediate neighbors, embedding it in regional memory and ensuring that the Carver household became a symbol of both domestic diligence and vulnerability to unforeseen hazards. Psychologically, the community's reactions were complex. Anxiety, fascination, and moral judgment intersected, creating a shared consciousness of tension and expectation. Individuals internalized lessons from the incidents, adjusting their own behaviors in domestic routines, social interactions, and personal vigilance. The events became a template for navigating risk, emphasizing attentiveness, careful supervision, and awareness of social perception. The Carver wedding night, though unique in its sequence of accidents and near misses, offered generalized guidance. A cautionary tale demonstrating that even ordinary households could become sites of heightened danger under conditions of isolation, fatigue, and concentrated social expectation. Family members themselves experienced a combination of relief, embarrassment, and reflection. Jonathan Carver, while maintaining outward composure, internalized the intensity of the night, recognizing how quickly control could be challenged by minor mishaps. Margaret, still pale and reserved, reflected on the fragility of domestic order and the subtle interplay of environmental hazards and human error. Their observations informed adjustments in household routines, preventive measures, and social engagement. Guests carried home stories, warnings, and reflections, reinforcing communal awareness of potential hazards while weaving the narrative of the Carver's night into the broader fabric of local history. The social memory of the events extended into subsequent gatherings, community rituals, and oral histories, Each retelling emphasized different aspects: the near misses, the shadows that seemed alive, the calm efficiency of Margaret and Jonathan amid chaos. Psychological interpretations coexisted with practical advice, moral framing, and speculative intrigue. Over time, the wedding night was elevated from a personal domestic event to a collective narrative, a story of human frailty, vigilance, and the uncanny unpredictability of frontier life. The intersection of factual incident and social interpretation ensured that the Carver household remained a touchstone for reflection, conversation, and caution, shaping the community's understanding of safety, morality, and domestic responsibility. By combining observation, rumor, medical advice, and moral guidance, the community created a layered understanding of the events. Each layer contributed to a sense of order, interpretation, and ongoing vigilance. Residents became more attentive to shadows, minor accidents, and the rhythm of domestic life, not only in the Carver household, but in their own homes. The narrative served both as a warning and as a cultural artifact, demonstrating how isolated communities interpreted, communicated, and memorialized events that combined ordinary hazard with extraordinary circumstance. Psychological, social, and moral considerations merged to form a framework through which subsequent generations would understand and discuss the Carvers' disturbing wedding night. In sum, the reaction of the Arkansas community to the Carver incidents exemplifies the intersection of practical concern, moral reflection, and psychological observation in a frontier society. The household's experiences were scrutinized, interpreted, and memorialized in ways that combined social expectation, domestic vigilance, and narrative imagination. Neighbors, clergy, medical practitioners, and journalists each contributed to a shared understanding that extended the meaning of the events beyond the immediate household. The result was a collective consciousness in which the ordinary and the extraordinary coexisted, and in which the quiet, creeping tension of the Carver wedding night became a benchmark for both caution and fascination across the region. As the Carver wedding night approached its darkest hours, the tension in the household reached a palpable intensity. Shadows clung to every corner of the room, dancing along walls and furniture in the flickering lantern light. The air, already heavy with warmth and smoke, seemed to thicken, compressing the space and amplifying every creak, every whisper, every subtle movement. Margaret moved with deliberate precision, her hands steady as she navigated the kitchen, carrying dishes and extinguishing small flares before they could ignite. Jonathan followed, ever vigilant, his gaze sweeping across the floorboards, the rafters, and the shadows that stretched unnaturally along the walls. The household was a stage, and the actors, though calm in appearance, were caught in a silent performance orchestrated by both human frailty and environmental unpredictability. The first truly alarming incident occurred near the hearth. A tray of boiling water, intended for washing dishes, tipped suddenly as a gust of wind entered through a half-open window. The scalding liquid threatened to spill onto a nearby guest, eliciting a collective gasp and a flurry of movement. Margaret's reflexes were swift. She intercepted the tray, spilling only a fraction of its contents, yet the moment left an indelible mark of tension. The room seemed to contract around the near miss, every eye registering the proximity of danger. The subtle terror was not rooted in dramatic violence, but in the awareness that ordinary domestic objects had transformed into instruments of potential harm. The household's carefully maintained order was momentarily suspended, and the latent anxiety that had simmered through the evening erupted in a rush of adrenaline, gripping every witness. Soon after, a series of cascading mishaps intensified the atmosphere. One of the children, startled by the sudden commotion, ran across the uneven floorboards, tripping over a rug and sending a lantern crashing to the ground. Sparks ignited the hem of a nearby curtain, producing a brief but intense flare. Jonathan and Margaret moved in unison, extinguishing the flame before it could spread, their movements precise but tense. Guests remained frozen, the ordinary domestic space now a theater of near disaster, each sound and shadow magnified into a signal of threat. The room's corners seemed alive, every object a potential hazard, every creaking beam a harbinger of catastrophe. The household itself became a participant in the drama, its imperfections amplifying the suspense and fear that had quietly accumulated throughout the night. In the dining room, a particularly chilling moment unfolded. A large wooden serving dish, laden with food, toppled from the table as a guest attempted to move past the crowded room. The crash reverberated through the space, accompanied by startled cries. Margaret and Jonathan, aware that panic could escalate, the situation further, moved with controlled urgency to secure the dish and calm the household. The incident highlighted the fragile balance of the environment. Close quarters, low lighting, and the presence of sharp or hot objects had transformed routine activity into a high-stakes endeavor. Every gesture, every step, and every glance carried amplified significance. The ordinary rhythms of domestic life were now interwoven with the heightened awareness of imminent danger, creating an almost unbearable tension. A more psychologically disturbing sequence followed in the upstairs quarters. One of the younger girls, frightened by the sounds of commotion, attempted to descend the stairs and slipped on a loose board. The cry of pain echoed through the house, freezing the motions of those nearby. Margaret, trembling but composed, rushed to the child's side, checking for injury while maintaining an aura of calm that prevented further panic. The shadows along the stairwell seemed to lengthen unnaturally, producing the eerie impression of figures moving independently of the family. The combination of physical threat, emotional intensity, and environmental distortion produced a sense of quiet horror, an almost cinematic interplay of light, sound, and human perception. The household had become a crucible in which fear, vigilance, and human error were fused into a single, unrelenting narrative. At the peak of the night's tension, a lantern fell from a high shelf, narrowly missing a guest and igniting the edge of a tablecloth. Flames licked upward for a brief instant before Margaret and Jonathan extinguished them, their movements a combination of learned precision and instinctual urgency. The room, now dense with smoke and heightened alertness, seemed to contract further. Shadows multiplied, voices were hushed, and the anticipation of further incidents hung heavily in the air. The interplay between environmental hazards, human reaction, and the psychology of fear created a crescendo of suspense, each minor incident contributing to a sense of cumulative terror. The ordinary household had been transformed into a space of near constant threat, and the line between accident and catastrophe blurred. Throughout the climax, Margaret and Jonathan's coordinated movements exemplified the delicate balance between control and chaos. They anticipated hazards before they manifested, guided guests away from danger, and managed the household with a tensioned precision born of both experience and acute awareness. Yet, despite their composure, the psychological weight of the night pressed upon them. Every glance, every gesture, and every creaking board carried significance, contributing to an almost tangible sense of apprehension. Guests, too, were caught in the interplay, their own fear magnified by observation and social expectation. The room, alive with anticipation and nearly imperceptible threat, had become a theater of suspense in which ordinary domestic life teetered on the edge of disaster. The external environment compounded the internal tension. Wind rattled windows, distant animal cries echoed across the darkened hills, and the occasional tree branch struck the exterior walls, producing startling sounds. The isolation of the Carver home intensified the sensation of being trapped within, a small, fragile space where every sound and shadow mattered. Within this setting, the domestic rituals of serving food, extinguishing fires, and tending to children were suffused with the possibility of unexpected escalation. The night's events underscored the fragile boundary between safety and harm, demonstrating how quickly ordinary domestic life could evolve into a night of relentless tension and quiet horror. As the night neared its conclusion, the cumulative effect of these incidents reached its peak. Every participant, from the youngest child to the oldest guest, experienced heightened perception, a nervous attentiveness to detail, and an awareness of the fragility of order. Shadows on the walls seemed almost sentient, objects assumed threatening significance, and the mind's imagination filled every gap with potential danger. The climax was not defined by a single catastrophic event, but by the accumulation of tension, near misses, and heightened perception, producing a psychological and physical intensity that left the household and its guests deeply affected. The Carver wedding night, intended as a celebration, had become a testament to human vigilance, environmental unpredictability, and the subtle, pervasive power of fear. When the household finally settled, exhausted yet intact, the imprint of the night lingered. Guests departed with stories, advice, and reflection, while the Carvers themselves assessed the evening's events and the fragile victories over potential disaster. The climax had demonstrated the intersection of human skill, environmental hazard, and psychological tension, producing an experience simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. The Carver home, with its shadows, objects, and attentive occupants, had been transformed into a site of domestic drama, suspense, and near catastrophe, a night that would endure in local memory as both a warning and a source of fascination. The intensity of the night, its crescendo of incidents, and the careful navigation through danger cemented its place in regional folklore as a disturbing, unforgettable wedding night. When the house finally fell into silence, the echoes of the night lingered long after the last guest had departed. The Carvers moved through the dimly lit rooms with careful deliberation, attending to small hazards, resetting furniture, and extinguishing lingering sparks. Yet beyond the physical tasks, an intangible residue of tension remained, a persistent awareness that the ordinary had become extraordinary, that domestic spaces could harbor unforeseen dangers. Shadows seemed longer, corners darker, and each creak of the floorboards suggested histories yet unspoken. In the quiet, the family contemplated not only the incidents themselves, but the deeper implications, the fragility of life, the unpredictability of circumstance, and the relentless presence of unseen forces within even familiar surroundings. Neighbors continued to discuss the events in hushed tones for weeks. The story of the Carver wedding night took on the quality of legend, each retelling emphasizing different aspects: the near-tragic accidents, the shadows that seemed alive, the vigilance of Margaret and Jonathan, and the tense energy that had saturated the house. Psychological interpretations were layered with moral reflection and social commentary. Some speculated that divine providence had guided the household through the night's perils, while others suggested that the accumulation of minor hazards represented a convergence of human error, environmental risk, and the pressures of social expectation. The ambiguity of these events allowed them to occupy a space between the historical and the uncanny, between fact and folklore. The family itself carried the memory with a mix of relief, caution, and lingering unease. Margaret, in particular, reflected on the ways in which ordinary domestic routines could transform into moments of profound tension. Jonathan, observing the calm return of the house after hours of near disasters, acknowledged the delicate balance of order and chaos, the fine line that separated safety from catastrophe. Together, they made adjustments in household practices, implementing new routines to anticipate accidents, secure hazardous objects, and maintain vigilance during gatherings. The wedding night had imparted lessons that were practical, psychological, and moral, each intertwined with the other in the quiet, reflective aftermath. Speculation extended beyond the household itself. Local journalists and chroniclers of frontier life wrote accounts that preserved both the factual events and the eerie resonance of the night. The Carver wedding became a template for exploring the interplay between environment, human behavior, and the perception of danger. Scholars of social history, when they later examined the event, highlighted how isolated households relied on careful routines, keen observation, and communal awareness to navigate risk. The narrative, though specific to one family, illustrated broader principles about human adaptation to peril, the cultivation of vigilance, and the psychological imprint of tension and fear. The incidents became, in essence, a study of how ordinary domestic spaces could transform under pressure into arenas of suspense, reflection, and enduring mystery. Over time, whispers of the night's uncanny elements persisted. Shadows that had seemed unusually animated, the rhythmic creaks of floorboards, and the flickering lantern light became embedded in local folklore. Children and newcomers were warned to respect the house, to navigate its spaces carefully, and to honor the memory of the night when ordinary life had been so thoroughly upended. The boundary between historical fact and narrative embellishment blurred, yet the impact on communal memory remained potent. The Carver household stood as a testament not only to the accidents themselves, but to the way human perception, cultural expectation, and environmental factors could merge to create experiences that were both ordinary and extraordinary, natural and subtly uncanny. Reflective accounts of the night suggested broader implications for understanding domestic life in frontier America. Families like the Carvers navigated constant uncertainty, balancing social obligations, physical hazards, and moral expectations. Their experiences revealed how close observation, preparedness, and psychological resilience could mediate risk, yet also highlighted the persistent fragility inherent in isolated, labor-intensive households. The wedding night, with its cascading incidents and near disasters, became an instructive exemplar of the interplay between human action and environmental contingency, a narrative that resonated with both contemporary observers and later historians. HST Carver's story invites speculation that extends into the present. Was the household's near-catastrophic night merely a convergence of minor accidents? Or did it touch upon deeper, unexplained forces, the unpredictable weight of circumstance, the heightened perception of fear, or the almost sentient quality of shadowed quiet spaces? Such questions remain unanswered, yet they contribute to the story's enduring resonance. The night's events continue to fascinate because they operate simultaneously on multiple levels, as a historical record, a psychological case study, and a quietly unsettling legend of domestic life gone awry. In the end, the Carver family emerged, intact yet irrevocably marked by the intensity of that night. Their vigilance, quick reflexes, and careful coordination preserved life and property, but the psychological imprint lingered. The house, the objects within it, and the memories of those present carried forward a subtle, enduring tension. The story became a lens through which to consider human vulnerability, environmental unpredictability, and the layered complexity of social expectation. As the decades passed, the legend of the Carver wedding night persisted, a quiet reminder that even in ordinary domestic life, there is room for extraordinary fear, reflection, and mystery. The night, frozen in collective memory, invites continued contemplation, leaving an indelible mark on the landscape of Arkansas history and the imagination of those who hear its tale.